Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. Whether you work for government or industry, we're here to help you understand a little bit more about how the other side thinks. The topic today is about evaluation criteria in source selections. And to do that, Kevin welcomes special guest Charlie Hargett. In addition to being a member of the Skyway team, Charlie is a former government contracting officer. He spent 12 years on active duty as an Air Force contracting specialist. Then he worked as a government civilian in DoD with the Navy, the Army, and with the Defense Health Agency. He also supported the Department of Energy, then flipped over to work on the industry side. Let's get started with Kevin and Charlie's conversation about evaluation criteria.
In GovCon, we usually start with just our requirement. We got to know what we're buying, who it's for, what the primary purpose is, and so on. But that's just a foundation, and it can actually be one of the hardest parts to pin down. But once you have a requirement, there are two fundamental questions that are being asked. One's by government, and one's by industry, and they're two sides of the same coin. Government is asking, how are we going to pick one or several, if it's a multiple award, companies to do this? How do we thin the herd? How do we get down to one, right? And industry is asking, how are we going to be the one that they pick of several that they pick for if it's a multiple award? At the highest level, this is the overall acquisition strategy. That's what you're trying to figure out. But again, we got to keep these podcasts at the ground level because that's where we live. So at the highest level of the acquisition process, this is the overall acquisition strategy, but that's too high in the clouds here. We're going to stay at the ground level and pick on one piece of how the decision is made, and specifically the evaluation criteria.
Yeah, what we're talking about here is evaluation criteria and how the government structures that evaluation criteria to differentiate between offerers and ultimately make a selection for their procurements.
Yeah, they got to pick somebody, right? But before we dig in, let's stop and say thanks. Let's say thanks this week to John O'Shea. John is a contracts and proposal manager for Granite Telecommunications in Medford, Massachusetts. I want to thank John for taking the time to set up a phone call to give me his feedback on the podcast. He gave me a great metaphor for our podcast. He said it's like the government and industry are sitting at the dinner table, but there's a glass partition down the middle of the table that keeps us from understanding each other, right? And John said that our podcast kind of helps to remove that partition so both sides can communicate better. So I thought that was a great metaphor. I think it might be a simile because it's like, but anyway. And secondly, talking to people like John fires me up to know that the podcast is helping people to understand how to increase communication from both sides. So thanks, John, for being an active and engaged podcast listener and also for giving me your feedback. Okay, back to evaluation criteria. We'll start with, why is this important? I mean, evaluation criteria, that's how the government picks the winner, right? But understanding the evaluation criteria, it's a significant advantage for people who are trying to bid for work.
Right. And, one thing to take note of is that that's not necessarily an unfair competitive advantage. What you're trying to do is just get better understanding of where the government is looking for in terms of priorities. So it's important that you take every chance you can to get an advantage wherever possible.
So understanding the evaluation criteria, it's an interesting point. It's not an unfair competitive advantage because everybody can see them. But if you understand them, if you can actually apply them, that's different, right?
Something else to keep in mind too, when thinking about evaluation criteria, the government does not really focus on how pretty the marketing material is.
They don't? They're not concerned about that?
No, you want it to be professional looking, but really the bells and whistles that cost a lot of money for marketing software and that type of thing, it doesn't get as much attention as the compliance factor. So, really the evaluation criteria are based on the requirement, not necessarily the marketing prowess of the offerors. So keep that in mind and when you're looking at the compliance part of that.
Yeah, it's a really good point because you want to have some cake, right? Not just icing. I've used this metaphor before where you don't want to have too much icing but no cake underneath.
Yeah. Don't be all icing and no cake.
Yeah, the government wants the cake, right? That's the point of this.
Also, something else to keep in mind too, the government is just trying to decide the winner without digging their own protest grave, if you will. They have to figure out who the best contractor is going to be to fulfill their requirement, but they have to do so without painting themselves in the corner and risking losing protests.
I like that. The protest grave is, you don't want to set yourself up that the evaluation criteria are so wide open that anybody can protest that they're too wide open. But if they're so specific, then they can protest that they're too specific. So yes, you're walking the fine line. We've touched on the evaluation criteria in a couple of podcast episodes. I mean, one of them is episode 87 about the source selection process, where we talked about the evaluation criteria. Well, let's start with the definition of what are evaluation criteria. I mean, we'll call this like mini FAR time. We can kind of get the FAR references in here. In FAR Part 7, in acquisition planning, they talk about evaluation criteria.
Whether you're government or industry, it's important to know where to go in the FAR and understand where we're coming from when it comes, where the government's coming from when they're doing just about anything in the procurement process. And as it pertains to acquisition planning, FAR 7.105B4, I believe, source selection procedures, discusses this. It also includes the timing for submission of evaluation proposals. So, even in the acquisition planning stages, the government's looking at this. Part of that is something else that they're looking at is the relationship of the evaluation factors to the attainment of the acquisition objectives. So
that sounds like you're reading it out of the FAR.
Yeah, it's I have my notes here in front of me, but yeah, that is some of the language that's in the FAR. But it's, like I said, it's important that you know what the government's working from when you're trying to discern the meaning of these evaluation criteria that you're going to propose on.
The relationship of evaluation factors to the attainment of the acquisition objectives. That is such far language, but yeah, you're right. You totally have to understand it, because that FAR 7, would you read 7105B4? That's right. Where the contracting officer is required to come up with discriminating factors, i.e. evaluation criteria. And let's not forget that while this applies to acquisition planning and FAR Part 15, it also is in FAR Part 16, right? Under fair opportunity?
Right. So in the multiple award contract ordering arena, I guess, if you will, FAR 16.505 B B1, and I did have to write that down. I have a lot of these things committed to memory, but when you get down to that level, these references can be a bit lengthy. But anyways, it says that the contracting officer shall provide a fair notice of intent to make a purchase. And it goes on to say that the contracting officer shall provide the basis upon which the selection will be made,
which is otherwise known as evaluation criteria.
Evaluation criteria.
And the government can get creative with what they use as evaluation criteria. Price is, I don't want to say always, but my spidey senses tell me there's tough to find a spot where price isn't a factor. So it is almost always a factor.
You make a good point. Price is almost always a consideration. In fact, in FAR 15.304, it says that price shall be a factor when evaluating proposals. However, in NDAA 2017, I think is Section 825 of that NDAA, there isn't an exception that is now in place, and that is for the evaluation of multiple award contracts, and the contracting officer can choose to not evaluate price in those instances. But outside of that, price is always a factor.
And that's a rabbit trail for another podcast. And by the way, NDAA stands for National Defense Authorization Act.
Yeah.
Correct? Yes, that's the budget, FYI, for folks who may not know. But yeah, that's a really good point. And that's why I say I'm very, very rarely comfortable saying always or never when it comes to anything in federal regulations, because there's always something. But yeah, for the most part, price is going to be a factor.
Essentially, evaluation criteria, the elements of a requirement the government believes are the most important factors to consider when selecting a winner in a competitive solicitation.
In general terms, this is what? Technical, management, past performance, and price. I mean, that's at the high level.
Right. And you see that a lot, but they're depending on the requirement that the government is trying to solicit for, you might see some other things like evaluation of transition plans, or they want a deeper look at quality control plans. Sometimes they'll look for product samples, maybe retention plans or production capabilities, key personnel resumes. The list goes on. They could really go quite deep on what they look for. It just depends on what's important to them in the procurement.
Retention plans was one that applies specifically to service contracts, and particularly the ones that may have a high turnover. So I used retention plans on a particular service contract because one of the problems we had there was they were having a heck of a time retaining people, right? Because it was unique work in an austere, actually it wasn't austere so much as it was just far away location. But other places, retention's not difficult. So for somebody to say, yeah, I can retain people, well, of course you can, because there's a big workforce here. So yeah, that's, to your point, that's the creativity part. That's an evaluation criteria that's going to be opportunity specific. In fact, I wrote a blog a couple of years ago, a blog article about the importance of Section M, which is, FYI, is the evaluation criteria under the standard government contract structure. And the reason that I focused on Section M is this is how you win. When I was a contracting officer, I was focusing on Section M because that's how I clearly, or I hoped I clearly, explained how I was going to choose the actual winner.
Right. So when responding to an RFP, it is the evaluation criteria that must carry the most weight when developing win themes and proposal strategies. The government is telling industry what they want to see and how they will evaluate it. So keep that in mind. Listen to what the government is telling you in those evaluation criteria.
Yeah, I like your point about it carries the most weight, is that's telling you where to shine your headlights. and then a key factor here is if you're shining the headlights in an area where you don't have a competitive advantage, or for that matter, you don't even have a strength, which again, I can think of several proposals I got that they could do the work, but what we were going to award based on wasn't their strength. And the debriefing was ugly because they said, oh, yeah, we can do this. And I said, yeah, but that's not what we based the win on. So yeah, it can be, it seems kind of straightforward.
Yeah, the evaluation criteria can be tough to understand. So I have a couple things I wish everyone understands about evaluation criteria. One is it is hard for the government. They're the ones writing it, and they're the ones that you would think have done it time and time again. But trust me, having lived on that side of the fence for quite a long time, it is difficult for the government to come up with evaluation criteria. And the second thing is industry needs situational awareness around the evaluation criteria that the government puts in their final RFPs.
Situational awareness, meaning they're targeting, they understand the customer, they have a clear understanding of what their mission is. They're aware of what words mean at certain agencies. And to jump on your first one, you talked about being hard for the government. Yeah, this is a thinking job. This is another one of those examples. Slicing and dicing, which evaluation criteria do we keep? Which ones do we expand on? What's industry going to say or interpret? How are they going to interpret this when we put it out? I mean, yeah, both of those are key factors, and neither of them are easy to get. So let's start with it's hard for the government, right? So developing evaluation criteria, like I just said, it can be difficult because you got to take something really fuzzy and put it down in concrete words. Right.
And, it is difficult for the government for a multitude of reasons. One of the first things that comes to mind is oftentimes there's a disconnect between the contracting office and the program management office. Imagine that, right?
Yeah, a flood of stories. Yeah, the one that comes to mind is we were arguing over, this is funny, we were arguing over the use of sample task orders and how they can be very effective or they can be a massive time vampire. And this one particular opportunity, we ended up structuring them in such a way that we actually awarded them as real task orders, but they were niched enough that they were really valuable work. But if you do those as just busy work, for lack of a better term, for something to evaluate them against, that tends to irritate industry.
Yeah, thinking back on my time of working with program management offices on developing evaluation criteria, we had a requirement once where it was a really straightforward commercial item or commercial services, and the program office really felt like they needed to have some flexibility in selecting a vendor, but the question was, well, it's just a commercial service that really, just because of the amount of it we're buying, it didn't rise to the level of doing a trade-off. So there was a big disagreement over what it was the approach that we were going to take versus low price technically acceptable versus, a trade-off scenario. So that was a big disconnect there, because really the result of that, the program office wasn't communicating the requirement with us. We ended up doing a best value trade-off because they finally articulated some of the nuanced requirements around it, and we had to adjust the evaluation criteria. We had to adjust the requirement as a whole, as a matter of fact. But it's just that disconnect between the contracting and program management office that led to the disagreement in how we were going to approach the evaluation of the proposals.
I'm laughing because this is a phenomenal rabbit trail that we're going to peek down. We're not going to go down it. We're going to peek down it. But you raise a really good point that LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable opportunities, or RFPs. But one of the things that causes them is that the understanding or misinterpretation that it's a simple requirement. And again, this is that conflict between program manager and contracting officer. The program manager thinks that it's simple, or if they're not explaining it in such a way that the contracting officer mistakenly thinks that it's simple, then our instinct is, well, let's make this easy, and we do LPTA. And that's a bad idea because, like you say, once you get the rest of the story, you go, we can't do this as LPTA. Yeah. And so it's really, people say, how do you get to LPTA? Well, these are one of the ways. So it's a whole different podcast episode. But yeah, it all starts with the evaluation criteria discussion. Another one for me is a lack of experience or training in writing out these details. I mean, technical writing, it's a professional industry. I mean, that's a specialized skill. And as a contracting officer, I have an English degree, and I still had trouble writing these things out so that it was very clear what was going to happen when the RFP hit the street. And once I had a CETA support, systems engineering technical assistance support person, and they were really good at translating their technical jargon, I guess we'll call it, into evaluation criteria. But that was a rare one, right? Most of the time, it was very difficult to take technical language and clearly understand it and put it out there to make sure that people can clearly get it and respond to it well. Imagine, by what I just described, imagine how hard that is to do, even if you get writing well. Well, imagine how hard it is to do without training, with just just copy and paste from last time of, oh, yeah, this is going to be easy, or somebody in the chain thinks it's easy. It can be very difficult if your brain is not wired to take the complex and make it simple, because that's just not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing for government folks who have perhaps this is only their second or first or second or perhaps third procurement that they've worked on. The requirement could be very complex and challenging, and to try and limit the criteria to concise factors to make a source selection decision from it can be really challenging for them. And the lack of experience and training in being able to translate requirements into criteria can be tough.
And it goes both ways from both the program manager and the contracts person. They're teaming their way through getting these words written down, right? Another one is a lack of understanding of how industry, like I'm alluding to here, will interpret that RFP language.
This is really hard to know for the government folks because a lot of times they don't have any experience on the industry side of the equation.
Yeah, it's a really good point that the number of things that I thought were clear to industry and just weren't. Closing that gap is one of the reasons we started the podcast. And I think that's one of the reasons that, according to the survey we did last year, that 30% of our listeners are government folks. And they tell me during the podcast feedback sessions that I have with them that getting the industry viewpoint is critically valuable, particularly in this scenario where we have evaluation criteria you're trying to put out and being able to have an understanding of what is industry going to do with it, which, by the way, you get there by communication, by having draft RFPs and all that kind of stuff. So government, ask for their input. Don't wait. Again, raising my hand because I did this wrong. When you put that evaluation criteria out as final, when the RFP drops, it creates risk, right? Just being able to talk about them ahead of time, just being able to make sure people understand them. They don't have to agree with them, but if they understand them, at least you'll make some progress.
Yeah, that would definitely go a long way.
So let's jump over to the second part. We talked about why this is hard for the government. Now we're on the industry side where they need to have situational awareness, and that's basically it's context. They need context on what's going on.
Right. So earlier we talked about marketing and the government's more interested in cake versus icing. And this is an important point here. From the industry's perspective, when responding to an RFP, you want to adhere and respond completely to all the evaluation criteria. This point is vital.
And this goes back to a point I made earlier about understanding the language in the RFP. I mean, you get more context or situational awareness about an individual RFP and the evaluation criteria when you understand that individual customer.
Yeah, I mean, there's the list can go for miles on what some of the tea leaves you can read in evaluation criteria. There's all sorts of different things you can look at and kind of get some hints on where you stand competitively. Some of the things that come to mind, is this a follow-on or a recompete, or is this a brand new requirement? And this is important because incumbents have an inherent advantage. The government's generally risk adverse, and they do feel more comfortable with the incumbent sometimes.
Because the evaluation criteria may favor the incumbent. Because, like you said, that's that risk averse. You want somebody that we the government, when it's contracting officer, I want somebody who I know can do the work. Well, assuming that the incumbent did it well, the evaluation criteria may favor them.
And something else that comes to mind is what part of the requirement does the criteria link to? When looking at the evaluation criteria, you want to figure out where does it map to in the actual requirement in Section C if it's a Part 15 RFP. In the performance work statement, basically.
The reason that's such a big deal is we go back to what's the contract for, right? And
right.
You raise a really good point that where is this tied to the requirement? And by the way, if it's not tied to the requirement, then that's an indicator it's a crappy evaluation criteria. So yeah, really good point.
Yeah, and it goes back to it's really hard for the government.
Yeah, there you go. You're back to that.
Something else too is a lot of times having been on this side of the fence for a while now, I see these RFPs come out with a 1 week response time or a 2 week or just something unbelievably unrealistic. And you got to pay attention to that. If the government's not giving a lot of time for proposal responses, there's things you can do about that. But one thing you need to take away from there is the government probably has something in mind behind that timing of that. It could be they already have somebody that they have in mind, which is not a good thing on their part, but they could just be in a time crunch and they have no choice but to make it happen. But all those have implications on whether or not you respond, because the quality of your proposal will be impacted on a short lead time for RFP or for proposal preparation.
Let me throw in a bonus FAR time. In FAR 12.602, which is commercial procedures, this talks about streamlining the evaluation criteria. But it still requires that the evaluation criteria, and I'm quoting here, are tailored to the specific acquisition to describe the evaluation factors and relative importance of those factors. That's in 12.602A, if you're curious. But so the point is, even like you said, even if they only give a week to reply, the evaluation criteria have to be tailored and specific enough and provide relative importance of those factors. So the evaluation criteria need to be specific and clear. Otherwise, it's what you call it, a protest grave that we're digging into.
Yeah. A couple more, another thing to think about or to pay attention to is does the RFP that the government put out look like it was developed from a template, or worse, from a previous RFP?
Yeah, I never did that. I'm avoiding eye contact right now.
Yeah, no, and I certainly have been guilty of that too, especially early on in when I lacked the experience to develop evaluation criteria on my own. But you got to pay attention to that, because that leads to all sorts of problems downstream, and depending on where the errors are or where the template language is still existing in the RFP. It could have an impact on how the outcome of the source selection is. It certainly makes it challenging for the government, but it can really put industry at a disadvantage when they're trying to put proposals together that are competitive.
The critical factor here is, has the evaluation criteria or should have the evaluation criteria changed? And my instinct was, so we're buying the same thing. Well, I learned over time that technology could have changed, the industry base could have changed, the people that used to do this really well now only do it commercially. I mean, there's a whole lot of things to consider in there that make that whole copy and paste thing pretty dangerous.
The last thing, at least for today, that comes to mind, like I said, there's a plethora of things that you could really get into, but
we got to thin the herd somehow.
Yeah. The last thing I can think of for today, though, is how thorough are the answers to industry's questions? And if you're new to the government procurement process, you should know that in most RFPs, there's a Q&A period where the contracting officer will say to industry, you have 1 week or 2 weeks or however many weeks to ask questions about the RFP, and the government will answer them. And they'll post those answers for all to see. So one, you can figure out if there's a short time frame for the questions to be asked. Say the contracting officer only allows 5 days for questions to be asked. That's a tell. And then once the answers to those questions come out and they're posted for everyone to see, look at those. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned from that, not least of which is the detail in which the answers were provided. If there's not a whole lot of detail in there, that says a lot about the procurement process on the government side. And
I'll foot stomp this one, is that shame on the government side if you're not answering the questions. I know they're frustrating. My record, I think it was 127 questions in one RFP. What I've realized from this side is expect to get questions. And if you stop answering them or don't answer them at all, you'll stop getting them. And I used to think, oh yeah, everybody understands the RFP because they didn't ask any questions. Well, it turns out it's because I was crappy at answering them. And then what happened was, I'm smirking because those questions didn't go away. They just came up later in the cycle, like during the debriefing, and then worst case scenarios, again, raising my hand, in the protest. And so the questions don't go away. They just, it's like, what's that phrase? That problems gain interest over time. The smallest this problem's going to be is today, right? And it's hard to see it that way, which is why it's so important to communicate up front. If the answers are not detailed, if they're very nebulous and we answered this one just to check the box, folks are going to notice it.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to really emphasize too is we talked about how the government has a hard time understanding industry's point of view. A lot of times you'll see draft RFPs put out. That's your opportunity to go out there and provide feedback on evaluation criteria with the impact to competition and your chance to shape the RFP and perhaps make yourself more competitive when the final RFP comes out. So definitely take the opportunity if it's given to provide a response. The government does listen to that. And just one last foot stomp is be proactive. You can't protest evaluation criteria after you lose.
Yeah, that's a very expensive lesson to learn the hard way. Okay, speaking of lessons, we're going to wrap this up so we can actually edit it under 30 minutes. So this is great having you on the podcast, Charlie, and we'll see you on the next one.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, that's it for this episode of the Contracting Officer Podcast. We have some bonus content from this episode for Skyway community members inside the community, so be sure to check that out. If you're not a member, but you enjoyed this podcast, we invite you to check out the Skyway community at skywaymember.com. The Skyway community is the essential resource for anyone at any stage of starting, growing, and running a business with government contracts. We speak GovCon. We just updated the website and updated our membership levels. There's 3 different levels of membership, starting with a personal membership where you get access to all the training materials, This Week in Government Contracting emails, the webinars, the blogs. That's only $20 a month. The next level up are professional members who get access to the GovCon tools and the forum, the Ask a Contracting Officer forum, where you have access to the Skyway team. And for companies who need more guidance in the government market, we have premium memberships that include consulting hours built right into your membership. So you get all the other stuff plus consulting hours. All right, that's it for today's episode. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.